Senator Urquhart.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the debate on the Climate Change Authority Abolition Bill. We on this side will not be supporting this bill. I hope government senators and members consider the benefits of an independent climate change authority, an independent body that ensures all the available science is considered, all available perspectives are examined, and in order to provide our community with accurate information on our current emissions, on trends and forecasts, and for emissions reduction targets, and to provide this service to the community at arm's length from the bureaucracy, whose job is to advise the executive, not the nation as a whole. Set up to provide independent advice on Australia's emissions reduction targets, the new coalition government proposes to subsume the authority into the Environment Department. The clear goal of this move is to remove the independent advisory role and decrease transparency. As ideology has got in the way of climate change policy too many times over the past decade, it is vital that the scientific targets and policy that underpins our response to climate change is conducted by an agency independent of government. Independent advice and constructive criticism of government policy from public institutions is a positive measure. It should be encouraged, not shut down. This new coalition government is demonstrating it wants independent criticism, with over 50 reviews instigated in just the first few months of the parliament. Most are small reviews with set reporting dates without long-term analysis of an issue. This new government has instigated over 50 reviews spanning all areas of public expenditure, and yet the public body tasked with continually reviewing our response to climate change is up for abolition. This is just double standards. It is clear that we must not shy away from a national conversation on climate change. Regardless of personal views of anyone in this chamber, the problem is bigger than all of us. While it will be some time until a bipartisan approach to this issue is again reached, the problem will not go away. In fact, the problem will only get worse. As senators are well aware, around this time 4 years ago, bipartisanship on action on climate change was lost. Around 4 years ago, as we're all aware, Mr Abbott defeated Mr Turnbull by one vote and ended the bipartisan support for strong action on climate change, ended the bipartisan support for a price on carbon, and ended the bipartisan support for a legislated cap on emissions. And in many ways, it ended the bipartisan commitment to combat climate change. Because we all know from his own comments that the Prime Minister has never been serious about climate change. Just a few months before he won that leadership, Mr Abbott said that he was hugely unconvinced by the so-called settled science on climate change. That was in a rare appearance on the 7:30 report on the 27th of June 2009. It was a disappointing statement from someone who was aspiring to the top leadership position in the country. In 2009, the so-called settled science, as Mr Abbott put it, was at that point the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's fourth report, released in 2007. Created in 1988 by member states of the United Nations, the IPCC's mandate is to provide the world with a clear scientific view on the current state of knowledge in climate change and its potential environmental and socio-economic impacts. The report of the IPCC includes an assessment of scientific confidence that humans are causing global warming. At the time of Mr Abbott's appearance on the 7:30 report, the latest statement from the IPCC was its fourth report, released in 2007, and I quote just one key summary. Most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely, with 90% confidence due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. So this so-called science was a 90% certainty that global warming was being caused by humanity. This so-called science, settled science, was that there is a 90% chance that humanity's actions through emitting greenhouse gases were causing global warming. Now, of course, in science you don't ever say absolutely that one action is causing another, but you set out to seek to find a probability of a link between cause and effect. In 2007, the IPCC determined a 90% probability that human-induced greenhouse gas emissions were causing global warming. Many people make the logical leap that if you were told by international experts that there was a 90% certain that your house was going to burn down or your investments were going to turn sour, you'd do your best to mitigate these risks. You'd do your best to reduce the risks. The new Coalition's government approach is to ditch the clean energy mechanism and ditch the advisors. Their approach is like putting your head under a pillow and screaming, "It's just too hard." That's the problem of climate change is too difficult for Australia, that we're better off putting our head under a pillow and screaming that it's just too hard. Those opposite need to acknowledge new evidence when it is produced, new evidence from global experts, where the so-called settled science has only become more settled. Just a few months ago, the IPCC began releasing tranches of its fifth report. This release moves the confidence level from 90% in 2007 to 95% in 2013. 6 years on, based on new evidence and updated analysis, the IPCC is 95% certain that there is a direct link between humanity's actions and global warming. This so-called settled science is now, in 2013, settled to a degree that there is a 95% certainty that humanity's actions are causing global warming. I quote from the 2013 release. "It is extremely likely, with 95% confidence, more than half of the observed increase in global average surface temperature from 1951 to 2010 was caused by the anthropogenic increase in greenhouse gas concentrations and other anthropogenic forcings together. This so-called settled science is now that there is a 95% chance that humanity's actions through emitting greenhouse gases are causing global warming. In 2007, the IPCC determined a 90% probability that human-induced greenhouse gas emissions were causing global warming. By 2013, its evidence was such that it is now a 95% confidence of this link, 5% more. To use the previous analogy, the house is now 95% certain to burn down, the stocks are now 95% certain to crash in value. Australia needs to do our best to mitigate these risks. This new coalition government is foolish to have this independent advice and move to abolish the very institution that sets targets and provides critical appraisal of emissions reductions efforts. This new coalition government needs to get out from under the covers and back the evidence from global experts. The so-called settled science has only become more settled. It's interesting to note that there has been a subtle change in the language of the reports. The 2007 statement only went to human greenhouse gas emissions, those gases that increase temperatures in the atmosphere, whereas the 2013 statement includes the impact of both greenhouse gas emissions and aerosol emissions on the climate. This includes the cooling effect from human aerosol emissions that many sceptics hold up as counter to global warming. The IPCC states that cooling from human aerosol emissions offsets about 1/3 of the warming from human greenhouse gas emissions. Critically, the 2013 statement says that even taking that cooling effect into account, humans are still the main cause of the global warming over the past 60 years. This is new information from the world's most eminent scientists. They consider that human activity, that is the warming activity from carbon emissions, net the cooling activity from aerosol emissions, is the main cause for warming. Times change, knowledge develops, and it is appropriate to reconsider one's stance. If there was ever a time to be convinced by the so-called settled science on climate change, it would be after the world's most eminent scientists have come to the conclusion that there is a 95% certainty that human activity is causing global warming. I participated in the Senate Environment and Communications Legislation Committee inquiry into these repeal bills. A quick inquiry, just one hearing and only a few days for people to make a submission. It's limited the ability of experts in the field to provide advice to the Committee on Legislation. The new coalition government referred the suite of repeal bills to the committee simply to examine the costs of pricing carbon on households and businesses. The opposition referred the bills on the basis of examining how they fitted with Australia's long-term climate change obligations. Put simply, we start from and continue to see this through very different lenses. One side, the new coalition government, see climate change in terms of purely the here and now, while on our side we see the problem in terms of the medium to long term. As important as any 2020 target is the need to have in place a pricing mechanism for emissions reduction beyond 2020, with targets for reductions at 2030 and 2050. We want to ensure the transition is a smooth one, but we acknowledge we have to start somewhere. The former Labor government put in place a suite of measures to address climate change, including the establishment of the Climate Change Authority. The value of the Climate Change Authority extends beyond carbon pricing. At present, the Independent Climate Change Authority performs 5 clear roles for government: to provide recommendations to the government on future pollution caps, to make recommendations on the indicative national trajectories and long-term emissions budgets, to provide independent advice to the government on the progress that is being made to reduce Australia's emissions to meet national targets, to conduct regular reviews on the carbon pricing mechanism, and to conduct reviews of and make recommendations on the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System, the Renewable Energy Target and the Carbon Farming Initiative. Its reporting schedule is publicly available, with 20 reports scheduled from 2012 to 2018 on topics including the Renewable Energy Target, national emissions reductions targets, carbon budgets, 5-year pollution caps, the Carbon Farming Initiative and voluntary action reviews. Quite clearly, these roles could be amended to refer to a different emissions reduction mechanism other than carbon pricing, for example, direct action. Its work can be separate from whether Australia has a carbon pricing mechanism, an emissions trading scheme, direct action, a carbon tax, or does nothing for a year or two, or however long some of those opposite would wish. We have a bipartisan emissions reduction target in this country. We've agreed that at the very least we must reduce Australia's emissions by at least 5% on 2000 levels by 2020. While we're clearly not agreed on the path to achieve that target, the target is bipartisan, and it is appropriate that reviews of how as a nation we are travelling to reach that target be conducted by an independent authority. I also note the Australian Conservation Foundation noted in its submission that the repeal bills do not reallocate the responsibility for consideration of renewable energy targets from the abolished Climate Change Authority. Is this just an oversight from government, or are there moves afoot to remove the renewable energy target? The clear goal of this move by the new coalition government is to remove the independent advisory role from the government sector and decrease transparency. This view is not just expressed by this side of the Senate. Many witnesses at the hearing and submissions to the Senate inquiry provided evidence to the same. Mr Irwin Jackson, Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the Climate Institute, noted the political record of climate change policy and highlighted the need for climate policies based on evidence, not the political agenda. He said of the Climate Change Authority, and I quote, "The Climate Change Authority plays an essential role in informing that climate change should be retained. Australia has a track record of highly politicised approaches to climate policy. This has produced policies that are often inefficient and continually readjusted, which in turn has resulted in significant business uncertainty, higher costs associated with investments and inadequate emissions reductions. To achieve a sustained emission reduction consistent with our national interest, Australia needs climate policies that are based on a sound foundation of evidence rather than political agenda." While the science appears settled, it is clear that climate change has been one of the most overtly political issues of the past decade. As such, it is vital that the scientific targets and policy that underpins our response is conducted by an agency independent of government. Consideration of abolishing or maintaining the Climate Change Authority or amending its functions is a separate matter to the carbon price mechanism. The authority's advice is valuable whether you want to pursue a market-based mechanism as we do, or a command and control policy as advocated for by the new coalition government. Both the Investor Group on Climate Change and Dr Frank Giozzo from the Australian National University highlighted in submissions and evidenced the worth of the Climate Change Authority under the Coalition's direct action policy. The investor group on climate change said, and I quote, "The Climate Change Authority's analysis assists investors to interpret the likely future emissions reduction trajectory for Australia and the scale of policy response that will be required." So here we have a group of investors who benefit from the independent advice provided by the Climate Change Authority. This independent advice assists these institutional investors, serious institutional investors, with total funds under management of approximately $1 trillion to make long-term decisions. Dr Giotso said in his submission, and I quote, "The institutions created in Australia as part of the clean energy legislation fulfil important roles in an effective climate change policy framework. This would be useful regardless of whether or not a carbon pricing mechanism is in place. The Climate Change Authority has a crucial role in conducting analysis about Australia's climate change policy settings, providing input to government and parliament. In its draft report on emissions targets, the authority has made it clear that its advice on Australia's emissions targets and trajectories is not tied to the existence of the carbon pricing mechanism." So again, here we have a climate change expert outlining that regardless of the carbon emissions abatement method, there are clear benefits for an authority that provides independent advice on pollution caps, carbon budgets, the credibility of international units and the performance of climate change mitigation initiatives. While the submission from the investor firm Regnan noted the risk to Australian business from the abolition of the Climate Change Authority, and I quote, "Abolition of the CCA increases the risk that Australian regulatory settings will move increasingly out of step with emissions reduction developments emerging at the international level in response to new science and global carbon budget commitments. The implications for Australian businesses would be to increasingly fall behind in carbon competitiveness, risking large and disruptive value impacts in the future. We see implications particularly for carbon-intensive companies with long-lived assets in the absence of regulatory settings which provide sufficient signalling to influence capital investment programs and technologies choices." So Regnan's advice to the committee was particularly insightful. Here we have a market investor. They could invest in coal energy, gas, transport infrastructure, you name it. They're advocating that investing in carbon-intensive companies is a risk to them and the people who trust them with their savings. These submissions aren't questioning the so-called settled science on climate change. They're focusing on how do we best mitigate our risks, how do we get on with the job of reducing our emissions. They accept the link between human actions and climate change. They appreciate the work of the Climate Change Authority and value its independence. Of course, this new coalition government is simply proposing to subsume the authority into the Environment Department. To do so would be to remove the independent advisory role and decrease transparency. Decreasing transparency, decreasing accountability and no doubt leading Australia not meeting the bipartisan commitment of a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020. There is a strong foundation of scientific fact underpinning the need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to reduce the risk of global warming above 2 degrees. The science is settled. The International Panel on Climate Change has moved the settled science from a 90% confidence that humans are causing climate change to a 95% confidence. There is nowhere left to go but to heed this advice and act. I encourage the new coalition government to look beyond the rhetoric and keep the independent Climate Change Authority. Recognise the public good that has contributed from quality independent advice. Recognise that this authority may assist in clarifying and developing your direct action plan. Climate change is too serious a problem to continue to play politics with it. The world is acting and Australia must contribute to global emissions reduction efforts. We need strong action with legislated emissions reduction targets. We need independent advice on climate change policy. As the chair of the Climate Change Authority, former Reserve Bank of Australia Governor Bernie Fraser recently said, and I quote, On a subject as complex as climate change, I would have thought every government, whatever its complexion, would want to get good independent advice. This independent advice will not be provided by a government department. Logically, we must keep the Climate Change Authority.
Thank you, Senator Urquhart.